Ethan sat in his small quarters, a modest room aboard the human warship stationed on the distant planet of Gorian. The days blended into one another as the usual routine of military life unfolded, training, strategizing, and maintaining equipment. The war against the alien forces had paused, but the tension never truly disappeared. He had been on this planet for what seemed like an eternity, though he had never grown accustomed to the alien landscape that stretched beyond the walls of the base. The peace that had come with the truce was fleeting, and Ethan, like many of his comrades, couldn't shake the feeling that something big was on the horizon. That's when the letter arrived. At first, Ethan thought it was another military communique, but when he saw the ornate seal, depicting the symbols of the Zalathan Empire, his curiosity piqued. He carefully broke the seal, his fingers brushing against the golden embossment, and pulled out the thick paper inside. It was a fine quality parchment, far more luxurious than anything he'd ever seen. His eyes scanned the contents quickly, and then he froze. By decree of the High Council of the Zalathan Empire, you are invited to the wedding of Princess Zafira and the chosen groom. Your presence is requested as an honored guest. Ethan's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. A wedding? On a planet like this? The Zalathans were known for their elaborate and often bizarre traditions. He'd heard rumors of their rituals, but he had never imagined that he, an ordinary soldier, would be invited to such an event. Not to mention, he didn't know the princess personally. This invitation felt like a mistake. He stared at the letter for a moment longer, and then his mind drifted to the thought of an opportunity to witness something truly unique. He had seen the Zalathans up close during peace negotiations, but this could be his first chance to witness their royal culture. He could hardly turn down an invitation to such a significant occasion, especially considering the connections he might make for future diplomatic efforts. A chuckle escaped his lips as he rolled the invitation back up. Well, can't hurt to attend, he muttered. He figured it would be a good distraction from the usual grind of soldiering and, if nothing else, a chance to see something outside the confines of the military base. He stood up, stretching his arms. The uniform he wore was standard issue, military grade, and didn't quite fit with the idea of a royal wedding, but he was sure there would be no harm in showing up in it. Maybe they'd give him something more appropriate to wear when he got there. After all, this wasn't some casual gathering. This was an event for the rulers of the Zalathan Empire. There was no telling what sort of spectacle it would be. The next day, he boarded a transport ship that would carry him to the alien capital. The journey was swift, and as the ship descended into the heart of the Zalathan Empire, Ethan gazed out of the porthole. The planet's landscape was a mix of alien architecture and untouched natural beauty. Towering spires of silver metal stretched into the sky, their tips gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. From above, the capital city seemed to pulse with life, its bright streets and exotic gardens alive with activity. But it wasn't just the view that caught his attention. It was the strange, unfamiliar creatures that populated the streets below. The ship touched down smoothly, and Ethan was escorted through a series of corridors by an overly polite Zalathan guide. The alien didn't say much, but there was an unspoken formality in every step, every glance. As they moved closer to the royal palace, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The palace was a grand structure, standing in stark contrast to the military base where he'd spent most of his time. It was elegant, with sweeping arches and crystalline walls that refracted the light in strange, mesmerizing patterns. When they entered the grand hall, the opulence of the place took Ethan's breath away. Huge chandeliers hung overhead, casting shadows over the extravagant guests who milled about. He could see a variety of alien species in attendance, each one more colorful and unique than the last. Ethan's guide pointed him toward a seat in the front row. "This way, sir," the guide said in flawless English, bowing slightly as he gestured toward a row of elegantly dressed Zalathan nobles. Ethan nodded politely, still trying to figure out what exactly he was doing here. He felt out of place in his military uniform, surrounded by aliens in fine flowing garments, but he tried his best to blend in. "Please take your seat," the guide urged. "You are expected." Expected? Ethan repeated, his voice rising, slightly in confusion. I'm just a soldier. Why would I? Please. The guide interrupted, his tone firm, but not unkind. You will see. With little choice, Ethan sat down, looking around the room. The air was thick with anticipation, and a low hum of whispers rippled through the crowd as they waited for the ceremony to begin. He adjusted in his seat, his eyes scanning the ornate decorations that adorned the palace walls. There were golden, statues of strange alien gods, their faces inscrutable, and the long line of attendants and courtiers only added to the royal atmosphere. As the minutes passed, Ethan grew increasingly uncomfortable. The whispers grew louder, and he began to feel the weight of many eyes on him. It was as if the whole room had turned its attention to him. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to ignore the odd sensation, but it didn't fade. He could feel the air grow thick with unspoken expectations. The sound of trumpets blared, and the guests in the hall stood. Ethan followed suit, though he wasn't sure what to expect. The doors at the far end of the room opened, and a figure emerged. The crowd gasped in unison, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Princess Zafira. She was everything the legends had described and more. Her long silver hair cascaded down her back, shimmering like liquid moonlight, and her eyes glowed with an ethereal, almost otherworldly light. She was draped in an intricate gown of dark violet and silver, her posture regal and poised as she glided toward the altar. As she moved closer, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Her beauty was overwhelming, but it was something else in her gaze that struck him. The weight of destiny, perhaps, or the certainty that this moment was as fateful as it was confusing. Then, as she reached the altar, she turned to face him, and for the first time since he had arrived, Ethan felt truly unsettled. The room fell silent. All eyes were on him now. Ethan stood at the altar, frozen in place, as all eyes in the grand hall turned toward him. The silence was deafening. Princess Zafira, with her otherworldly grace, locked eyes with him. Her gaze was intense, but there was a hint of something unspoken, something he couldn't quite grasp. It felt as if the world itself had paused. Ethan's mind raced. What was going on? Why are they all looking at me like this? The Zalathans had strange customs, that much was true. But never in his wildest dreams did he expect to be the center of attention at the wedding of a princess. And yet here he was, standing in front of a hall full of alien nobles and dignitaries, unsure of what to do next. The moment stretched on, and the quiet murmur of the crowd only made his discomfort worse. Finally, Princess Zafira spoke, her voice smooth and calm but carrying a weight that resonated throughout the hall. "Welcome, honored guest," she said, her words echoing in the vast chamber. The entire crowd seemed to hold their breath, waiting for her next words. It is time for the ceremony to begin. Her eyes never left Ethan's, as though she was expecting something from him. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment press on his chest. What is going on here? The high priest, a tall figure cloaked in deep crimson, stepped forward. His voice boomed with authority as he raised his hands to address the crowd. Today, we celebrate not just the union of two worlds, but the joining of two souls destined for one another. And with great honor, I ask the groom to step forward. Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. The groom. He looked around, half expecting someone to tap him on the shoulder and say it was all a joke. But no one did. The crowd watched him expectantly, their faces eager, almost reverent. The priest turned his gaze toward him, raising an eyebrow as though waiting for him to respond. The tension in the room was unbearable, and Ethan couldn't help but take a hesitant step forward. Wait a second. Ethan stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I'm not. This is a mistake. The high priest didn't seem to hear him, or perhaps didn't care to. He continued with the ceremony, his words flowing in a rhythmic chant that only seemed to confuse Ethan even more. A mistake? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Princess Zafira, standing tall before him, gave him a slight nod, as though reassuring him to continue. Her expression softened just slightly, but there was something unsettling about the way she looked at him. It was as if she were both familiar with him and a complete stranger, all at once. Ethan blinked and glanced at the royal guests around him. They all seemed so eager, their faces filled with a mix of excitement and reverence, as though the ceremony was unfolding exactly as it should. No one was surprised. No one was confused. Except him. I've never seen her before, Ethan thought, his gaze darting back to the princess. So why does she look like she's been waiting for me? His confusion deepened when a group of servants stepped forward, placing a shining silver crown atop his head. The weight of it was surprising, not just from its physical heft, but from the sense of finality that seemed to settle over him. A crown? What is this? The room around him felt distant, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold. Every movement, every gesture felt foreign, like he was caught in a dream, but unable to wake up. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as Zafira's attendants placed her own crown upon her head, and she stepped forward to stand beside him. Now, the priest continued, we shall proceed with the exchange of vows. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but the words stuck in his throat. The ceremony was moving forward with relentless certainty, and no one seemed to notice or care that he was utterly out of place. He was supposed to be a guest, an outsider, not the groom. How had this happened? Why had he been chosen for something he knew nothing about? The priest turned to Princess Zafira. Princess Zafira, do you accept this human soldier, Ethan of Earth, as your maiden partner, to unite the two worlds in peace and prosperity? Zafira's eyes flickered with something like amusement, though there was a touch of sadness behind her smile. I do, she said, her voice carrying through the hall like a melody. Then, it was Ethan's turn. The high priest's eyes narrowed slightly as he turned to Ethan, his gaze sharp and expectant. Do you, Ethan of Earth, accept Princess Zafira as your bride and partner for all eternity, to lead your people in unity with the Zalathan Empire? Ethan's heart pounded. His mind screamed to reject this, to refuse, but the words wouldn't come. He opened his mouth, but his throat felt dry, and the weight of the moment seemed to squeeze the air from his lungs. The entire hall was waiting, eyes fixed on him. Ethan glanced back at Zafira. There was something in her gaze, something understanding, something he couldn't quite place. She wasn't forcing him into this, but there was an inevitability about it. It was as though the universe had already decided. He stammered, trying to find the right words, but nothing came. He couldn't back out now, not with everyone watching, so instead he nodded, the motion small but enough to signal his acceptance. I do, he said, his voice almost a whisper. The crowd erupted in applause, and the priest raised his arms triumphantly, declaring the ceremony complete. The weight of the moment hit him all at once. He had just agreed to marry a princess, an alien princess, and yet the reality of it didn't seem to match his understanding. Zafira smiled, though her eyes held a depth of emotion he couldn't fully comprehend. She took his hand, and as their fingers brushed, a strange sensation coursed through him. It was electric, almost like the very air around them had shifted. But before he could ponder it further, the hall exploded into celebration. Music played, and the guests began to mingle, laughing and congratulating the couple. But Ethan remained rooted to the spot, his thoughts racing. What had just happened? The rest of the evening passed in a blur. He couldn't remember much of what happened next, other than the overwhelming sense that his life had just changed forever. He was no longer just a soldier. He was now bound to a princess, an alien world, and an empire he had barely begun to understand. The grand hall had emptied by the time Ethan made his way through the labyrinthine corridors of the palace, escorted by the silent guards in ceremonial uniforms. The weight of the day was too much to process, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in his gut. What had just happened? It felt like he had stepped into an alternate reality, a reality where he was no longer just a soldier, but something else entirely. He had barely managed to speak during the vows, and now, here he was walking down cold, ornate hallways toward a room he could only assume was his new quarters. The walls of the palace gleamed, the deep blues and silver accents reflecting the eerie glow from the alien light sources above. It all felt like a dream, a beautiful, overwhelming dream. And he was the one who had no idea what was going on. As he entered the spacious room, he was greeted with another shock. An elaborate outfit had been laid out on the bed, far more elegant than anything he had ever worn in his life. The fabric shimmered in the light, and the intricate designs on it suggested something both regal and foreign. It was clearly a wedding garment, and there was no question about its intended purpose. It was for him. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You are expected at the royal chambers, Commander Ethan." He turned to find one of the palace attendants standing in the doorway, holding a silver tray with a glass of what looked like some kind of exotic drink. The attendant's face was serene, as though the entire situation was perfectly normal. Ethan couldn't help but feel the overwhelming weight of the title that had been forced upon him. "Commander?" Ethan repeated, his voice thick with confusion. "I'm not a commander. I'm just a soldier." The attendant bowed slightly. "You are now, sir, by the decree of the princess." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. He glanced at the strange garment once more and sighed, finally shrugging as he took the glass from the attendant's tray. The liquid was cool and sweet, almost like a fruit juice, though he couldn't place the taste. As he drank, he tried to steady his nerves. What's going on? Why does this feel so inevitable? The attendant's face remained impassive, but as he turned to leave, he paused at the doorway. "The princess awaits." Ethan nodded, though he felt far from ready. The weight of the crown on his head still felt foreign, as though it didn't belong there. But he had no choice. He had been swept into something far larger than himself. The Zelithan Empire, the princess, the ceremony. All of it felt like a puzzle he had been thrown into without a map. When he entered the royal chambers, the first thing that struck him was the sheer elegance of the room. It was dimly lit, the soft light flickering from what seemed like 1,000 glowing orbs embedded in the walls. The room was furnished with luxurious materials that Ethan had never even heard of, silk-like fabrics in colors that didn't quite exist in the human spectrum, along with delicate alien sculptures. At the center of it all stood Princess Zafira. She was dressed in a gown so elegant it seemed to shimmer with every movement, the silver threads of it dancing in the soft light. Her eyes met Ethan's as he entered, and for a moment he felt a strange chill run through him. There was something in her gaze, something that seemed to acknowledge his confusion, but at the same time, something deeper, something unspoken. "Welcome, Ethan," she said, her voice soft yet commanding. It was a voice that carried with it the weight of an empire, but also something warmer, almost familiar. "I know this is all overwhelming." Ethan didn't know how to respond. The words he wanted to say were lost somewhere in the back of his mind, tangled in confusion and fear. I don't understand," he managed to say after a long pause. "I came here as a guest. I didn't come here to marry you. This is a mistake." Zafira stepped closer, her presence filling the room. There was an undeniable authority in her posture, but also a gentleness in the way she regarded him. "This was never a mistake, Ethan. This is fate." The word fate echoed in his mind. He looked at her, trying to piece together the reality of what was happening. "But I'm just a soldier. You didn't choose me. This isn't something I agreed to." His voice shook, but he couldn't stop himself from speaking. "Why me?" Zafira's eyes softened. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm, her touch warm despite the coldness that lingered in the room. "Ethan, I know this is hard for you to accept, but you were chosen. It is an ancient Zelithan prophecy. My marriage to you is the fulfillment of that prophecy, one that has been passed down for generations." The word sent a shiver down his spine. A prophecy? He shook his head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over him. "But I don't even know you. I don't know anything about this world, about your people. How could I be The one. Zafira let out a soft sigh and motioned for him to sit beside her on a large cushion by the window. The stars outside the glass sparkled like diamonds, distant and cold. When I was young, I was told of the prophecy, she continued, her voice steady. It was said that the human who would unite our people with yours would not be a leader, nor a prince. He would be a warrior, a soldier, someone who embodied the strength, the courage, and the resolve that both our peoples need. You, Ethan, are that man. Ethan's mind reeled. He had never asked to be part of any prophecy. He wasn't a hero. He was just a soldier following orders, doing his job. But now, it seemed as though the universe had decided for him. He was trapped in a fate he had never chosen. This is insane, he muttered, standing up and pacing. You're asking me to be the leader of two entire worlds. How can I do that? Zafira's eyes followed him calmly, her face unreadable. You already have done it, Ethan. Every action you've taken here has been in line with the prophecy. Your bravery, your resilience, it's why the Zalathan Empire has chosen you. Ethan stopped pacing and stared out the window at the stars. The weight of it all was too much to comprehend. How could he, just a human soldier, be expected to unite two worlds? He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't prepared. And what happens now? He asked, turning back to face her. Zafira stood and took a step toward him. Now, she said softly, we begin our lives together. There is much to learn, much to understand. And we will do it together. For the first time, Ethan saw something different in her eyes. It wasn't just duty or obligation. There was hope there. Hope for something new. Something neither of them had expected. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain. Nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Ethan paced around his quarters, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. A prophecy? He couldn't get the word out of his head. It felt like a cruel joke. He had come to this alien planet as just a soldier, someone who fought wars, followed orders, and lived for the next mission. But now, he was a part of something much bigger, and he didn't know how to handle it. The walls of his room seemed to close in on him, and he glanced at the lavish wedding garment still lying on the bed. It looked too perfect for him to wear. The gold threads shimmered in the dim light, mocking him with their beauty. What kind of soldier wears something like this? His mind returned to Zafira. Her presence had been calm, soothing even, but there was something in her eyes when she spoke of the prophecy, something that hinted at the weight of the task ahead. She wasn't just a princess. She was someone who had lived her entire life, with the knowledge that her destiny was to be tied to a human soldier. Ethan wondered if she had any idea how strange this was for him. How could she? She had been raised to know the prophecy, to understand her role in it. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. I'm not meant for this. I'm not a leader. I'm just a soldier who followed orders. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He quickly wiped his hands on his pants, trying to regain some sense of composure. When he opened it, he found a servant standing there holding a tray with a small, delicate-looking dish and a note. Princess Zafira requests your presence, the servant said in a soft voice. Ethan nodded. I'll be there shortly, he replied. The servant didn't leave, standing patiently as if waiting for something. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Is there something else? Just this, the servant said, handing him the tray with the dish. For you. It's from the princess. Ethan took the dish, eyeing it cautiously. Thank you, he muttered, and the servant bowed before leaving him alone. He stood there for a moment, staring down at the dish in his hands. It was some kind of sweet, vibrant fruit, sliced carefully into small pieces. There was no telling what it was, but the scent that wafted up from it was intoxicating, a mix of fruits and spices he had never smelled before. He shrugged, trying to distract himself from his own thoughts, and took a bite. The flavor exploded in his mouth, sweet, tangy, and unlike anything he had ever tasted. It was delicious, but it didn't bring him comfort. Instead, it only reminded him that he was now part of something he didn't understand. A part of a world that was not his own. The journey to Zephyra's chambers felt like it took an eternity. As he walked through the winding corridors, the weight of the crown on his head felt heavier with every step. It wasn't just the crown, though. It was everything. The eyes of the Zalathans followed him everywhere he went, their gazes full of unspoken expectations. When he finally reached her chambers, he hesitated at the door. What am I even supposed to say to her? He knocked softly, and after a brief moment, Zephyra's voice called from the other side. "Come in, Ethan." The room inside was quiet, with soft golden light filtering in through the windows. Zephyra stood by the balcony, gazing out at the city below. The palace was high up, and the view stretched out for miles. Ethan could see the vast expanse of alien architecture, their shining buildings illuminated in the distance like stars scattered across the horizon. Zephyra turned when he entered, her eyes catching his. "I see you've had the fruit," she said with a smile. Ethan didn't know how to respond. He had been avoiding looking directly at her, but now that he was standing in front of her, the reality of what was happening hit him again. She was beautiful. There was no denying that. But it wasn't just her beauty that stood out. There was an air of authority about her, an innate confidence that made it clear she was not someone to be trifled with. She was a princess, and now she was his partner in this strange marriage, this strange union. "I didn't expect you to come," she continued softly, her voice like a soothing melody. "But I'm glad you did." Ethan cleared his throat, feeling awkward and out of place. "I didn't exactly have much of a choice," he said with a small chuckle, though it didn't reach his eyes. Zephyra's gaze softened, and she moved closer to him. "I know this is difficult for you," she said. "But you don't have to go through it alone. We'll figure this out together." Ethan wasn't sure how to take her words. Together? It sounded reassuring, but the weight of everything still pressed on his chest. He had no idea what was coming, no idea how to be the partner she needed, and more than that, he had no idea how to be the man the Zalathan people expected him to be. "I just don't understand," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "How could I be the one? I'm just a soldier. I never asked for this." Zephyra's eyes studied him, and for the first time Ethan saw a flicker of vulnerability in her gaze. She stepped closer, her presence calming, yet powerful. "You don't have to understand it all right now, Ethan, but the prophecy, it's not just about me. It's about us. The two of us coming together, leading our people. You and I, we're stronger together than apart." Ethan swallowed hard, her words settling in his chest. He wanted to argue, to push back, to say that this wasn't his fight, that he wasn't the man she needed, but something about the way she said it, the certainty in her voice, made him hesitate. Zephyra reached out, placing her hand on his. "Trust me," she said softly. "The universe has brought us together for a reason, and we will succeed together. I believe in you, Ethan." There was something in her voice, something so genuine that it tugged at him. Despite everything, despite the confusion and the chaos of the situation, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe she was right. Maybe he wasn't just a soldier. Maybe he had a role to play in all of this. A role he wasn't sure he was ready for, but a role he had no choice but to accept. He nodded slowly, looking into her eyes. "I'll try," he said quietly. "I'll try to be the man you need me to be." Zephyra smiled, the warmth in her eyes making Ethan feel, for the first time since his arrival, a little less alone. "That's all I ask." As they stood there together, the weight of what was to come settled over them both. The future was uncertain, and the challenges they faced were immense. But for the first time, Ethan didn't feel like he was walking this path alone. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The days that followed Ethan's unexpected marriage to Princess Zephyra were a blur of formal meetings, strange customs, and endless questions that seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. He had been thrust into a role that was far beyond anything he had ever prepared for. The weight of the crown, though light in weight, felt heavier each day as he tried to understand his new place in the Zalethan Empire. Zafira, ever patient and understanding, guided him through each new responsibility. They held public appearances, together, and Ethan did his best to play the part of a royal consort, though every fiber of his being screamed that he didn't belong. The Zalathan people, despite their warm acceptance, watched him closely, measuring his every word, every movement. He could feel their eyes on him at all times, like a weight he couldn't shake off. But it wasn't just the royal court that was watching. A simmering unrest was growing beneath the surface of the empire, and Ethan could feel it. It was a subtle thing at first, an offhand comment here, a glance there, but it quickly escalated. Whispers of rebellion were on the rise. It started in the outer provinces, far from the capital. Reports began to trickle in describing small uprisings against the royal family, the very people who had supported Zafira's reign. These rebels, a faction of Zalathan extremists, believed that the alliance with the humans was a betrayal. To them, Zafira's marriage to a human soldier was an unforgivable act, one that threatened the purity of their bloodline and the future of the empire. Ethan wasn't sure what to believe. He had come to know Zafira as someone who genuinely cared for her people. But now, it seemed like everything was falling apart. And the tension only grew when a group of rebels launched an attack on one of the Zalathan's key military outposts on the outskirts of the capital. The rebellion wasn't just about political control. It was about something much deeper. The fear that Zafira's choice to marry a human was a sign of weakness, a sign that the Zalathans could no longer protect their heritage. The rebels believed that this union between human and alien was the beginning of the end for the Zalathan race. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door of his chambers. It was a sharp knock, urgent, anxious. He rose from his chair, his mind still preoccupied with the reports he had been reading. When he opened the door, he found one of Zafira's personal guards, his face grave. "Commander Ethan," the guard said quickly, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "There is word of a rebellion. The rebels have taken control of several districts on the outskirts of the city. We need you to come with us immediately." Ethan's heart raced. He had seen battles before, but this wasn't just any battle. This was the Zalathan Empire, an empire that, until now, had seemed unshakable. And now it was crumbling under the weight of internal conflict. He could only hope that the rebellion would be contained before it spread further. "I'll be ready," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. The guard nodded and turned on his heel, leading Ethan down the long hallways of the palace. As they moved, the tension in the air grew thicker. Servants hurried by, their faces pale with fear. The palace, usually full of life and energy, now felt empty, haunted. When they reached the war room, Zafira was already there, standing beside her military advisors, her face drawn with worry. As soon as she saw Ethan, she motioned for him to join her. "I'm glad you're here," she said, her voice calm but strained. "The situation is worsening. The rebels have taken several districts on the outskirts, and they're moving closer to the heart of the city. We need to act quickly before they disrupt the capital." Ethan nodded, his mind already racing with possible strategies. But there was something else in Zafira's expression, something that made him hesitate. "Zafira," he said softly, stepping closer to her. "Are you sure this is just about the rebellion? I've heard rumors, whispers that this is about more than just power. These people, they fear us. They fear our union. They see it as the end of their way of life." Zafira's face hardened, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I know," she said quietly. "I've heard the same whispers, but what they don't understand is that the future of the Zalathan Empire isn't about the past. It's about building something new, something stronger. I won't let them tear that down." Ethan could hear the conviction in her voice, but there was something else there too, a deep underlying pain. This rebellion was not just about her role as a leader. It was personal. Her people, the ones she had spent her life protecting, were now rejecting her, blaming her for a choice she had made to protect their future. "I'll stand with you," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Whatever it takes." Zafira's eyes softened for a moment, her shoulders slumping slightly in relief. She placed a hand on his arm. her touch warm and grounding. "Thank you. We'll need every ally we can get. But this is not just about us anymore. This is about the future of our people, both human and Zalathan." They both turned back to the table, where a map of the city lay spread out before them, showing the rebel movements and the military positions. The next few hours were a blur of strategy and preparation. Ethan found himself at the front of the battle lines alongside Zafira, her strength and resolve becoming the rallying cry for those who still stood by her side. They fought side by side, not as separate races, but as allies united by a common goal to protect their future. As they rode out to the front lines, Ethan felt a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for Zafira, for the Zalathan people, and for the fragile alliance between their two worlds. This battle, he knew, would be the turning point. The outcome would shape the destiny of both races. The sound of blaster fire echoed in the distance, and Ethan gripped his weapon tightly. This was no longer just a battle for control. It was a battle for hope, for unity, and for the future of both their people. The battle had raged through the night. The sounds of blaster fire, the clashes of alien weapons, and the roar of engines echoed through the city, creating a chaos that felt endless. Ethan had never imagined that his life would be shaped by such violence. But here he was, standing in the middle of a war not his own, fighting not just for his survival but for the future of an empire. Zafira stood beside him, her sword in hand, her face a mixture of determination and fatigue. She had led her people into battle, showing them the strength and resolve that made her the ruler she was. But now, as the dust settled and the cries of the wounded filled the air, there was a silence between them, a quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. The rebels had been defeated, their forces scattered, and their leaders captured. It had been a hard-fought victory, but it was one that had come at a great cost. Ethan's clothes were torn, his body bruised and covered in dirt, but it was nothing compared to the weight of what he had just witnessed. The lives lost, the sacrifices made. It was a price that none of them had chosen, but it was one they would have to live with. Ethan looked over at Zafira, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the battlefield. The moment the battle had ended, the cheers of victory had slowly faded, leaving only a quiet sense of exhaustion. It wasn't the victory he had imagined. There was no joy in it, no sense of triumph. The cost had been too high. Zafira caught his gaze, and for a brief moment, there was something soft in her eyes. "You did well," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of both gratitude and sorrow. Ethan didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure he felt like he had done well. He had fought because he had no choice, because the Empire needed him. But the reality of what they had just done, what they had fought for, was more complicated than he could have imagined. "The rebellion is over," he said slowly, still trying to process everything. "But at what cost?" Zafira sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly as she lowered her sword. "The cost of unity," she said. "A difficult price to pay, but necessary for the future." Ethan wasn't sure if he agreed. The battle had torn the city apart, and many lives had been lost. It wasn't the future he had envisioned when he first arrived on this planet. It wasn't the peaceful alliance he had hoped to help build. But as he looked at Zafira, he saw something in her eyes, a strength that went beyond the role of a princess. It was the strength of a leader who had fought for something more than power. She had fought for her people, for the future of both the Zalathans and humanity. And in that moment, Ethan realized that her fight had become his own. "We've won this battle," Zafira said, her voice steady. "But there will be more challenges ahead. The rebels may be defeated, but the divisions in the Empire remain. There are still those who will resist this union, who will never accept a future with humans." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had seen the hatred, the fear in the eyes of the rebels. They saw him as an outsider, as a symbol of everything they feared. But Zafira was right. The battle was just the beginning. The real challenge would be the work they would need to do to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. I know, he said quietly, but we can rebuild. We can show them that this alliance is worth fighting for. Zafira looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. I believe you're right, but it won't be easy. It will take time, patience, and understanding, and we'll need to stand together, not just as rulers, but as partners. Ethan met her gaze, his heart heavy but resolute. For the first time since this whole ordeal had begun, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He wasn't just a pawn in someone else's game. He was part of something bigger, something that had the potential to change the future of both humans and Zalathans. I'm with you, Zafira, he said, his voice steady. For as long as it takes? Zafira smiled, the weight of her burden lightening for a moment. Thank you, Ethan. I couldn't do this without you. They stood together side by side, watching as the sun began to rise over the city. The battle was over, but the work ahead would be even harder. There would be those who resisted their union, who would try to tear apart the fragile peace they had fought so hard to protect, but they would face it together, as partners in this new world they were building. As the days passed, the city began to rebuild. The streets were cleared of debris, the wounded tended to, and the families of the fallen mourned. But amidst the devastation, there was a sense of hope. A new dawn was breaking over the Zalathan Empire, one that had never existed before. It was a future that had been born of struggle, but it was also one that had the potential to unite two species in ways no one had ever imagined. Zafira and Ethan worked together, traveling from city to city, speaking to the people, showing them that their union wasn't a threat, but a promise. A promise that both humans and Zalathans could build a future together, a future where their differences were not something to fear, but something to celebrate. It wasn't an easy task, and there were setbacks, but with every challenge, they grew stronger. Ethan found himself becoming more than just a soldier. He became a symbol of the possibility of unity, a living proof that people from different worlds could come together and create something greater than themselves. And with each day, he grew more and more confident in his role. Zafira, too, grew into her role as a leader. She had always been strong, but now she was more than just a princess. She was a queen, a ruler who had fought for her people and her future. Together they faced the challenges ahead, knowing that the path they were on would not be easy, but it was one they would walk together. In the end, their bond, the bond they had forged in the heat of battle, the bond that had united two worlds, became the foundation of a new era, a new beginning, where the future was built not on fear and division but on hope, strength, and the belief that even the greatest of enemies could find common ground. And as the sun set over the Zalathan capital, Ethan stood with Zafira by his side, knowing that whatever came next they would face it together, as partners, as allies, and as something more, something that would shape the future for generations to come.